You hear this term deep state all the time these days, but like, have you ever thought about what happens when a leader actually tries to purge those institutions?
Yeah.
It's like they want to just get rid of all the experienced people. And we've been looking into this whole idea of purging institutions with a focus on the U.S.
It's a really fascinating and disturbing trend when you start to see these parallels between what's happening here and some of the things we've seen historically.
And that's what we're going to do today, right? We're going to look at confirmed cases,
right?
Look back at some of the historical parallels,
yep.
and then really examine what safeguards are in place to stop this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so interesting is how agencies like the FBI and the DOJ became these focal points in this whole battle between loyalty and expertise, especially when they were investigating powerful figures.
That's right. And you can't talk about this without bringing up the firing of James Comey back in 2017.
Oh, absolutely.
He was the FBI director, and it was only the second time in history that an FBI director had been fired. And this happened right as the Russia investigation was going on.
Right in the middle of it. And what makes it even more significant is that Trump himself later admitted on TV that he fired Comey because of this Russia thing.
Wow.
So he pretty much admitted that he was trying to shut down the investigation.
Pretty blatant.
It is. And firing the head of the FBI is a pretty direct way to try and do that.
That's a huge deal on its own. But our sources also detail other officials who were targeted too.
Yeah.
Specifically folks involved in Trump-related investigations.
Right.
Andrew McCabe and Peter Strzok are two names that come to mind.
Absolutely. McCabe's firing was particularly jarring. I mean, it happened just 2 days before he was set to retire.
Wow.
After being publicly attacked by Trump for
months.
And officially, the reason was a lack of candor in an investigation, but a lot of people question whether that was the real reason or whether it was just politically motivated retaliation.
Well, and then he successfully sued to get his pension back.
He did.
So it does make you wonder.
Yeah, it raises serious questions about what was really going on there. And then you have the Strzok case.
Right.
Where he was accused of anti-Trump bias because of text messages that he had sent. And he was removed from the Mueller investigation.
Yeah, and they later found those messages didn't actually impact his work.
Yeah, they didn't, but it just shows you the climate at the time.
Yeah, it really does. So it wasn't just about individuals either.
Right.
These sources suggest there was a bigger effort to kind of reshape the Department of Justice itself under certain leadership. It felt like loyalty was more important than impartiality in some cases.
And we saw that with the way that certain U.S. attorneys were reassigned or removed when they were overseeing cases that were sensitive to Trump or his allies.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about silencing individuals. It seemed like it was about shaping entire agencies to a particular agenda.
Exactly.
And this is where this whole deep state narrative comes in.
Right, this idea that there was this hidden network of people working against the administration. It was used to justify going after career professionals in all sorts of agencies.
Yeah, it was a convenient way to discredit anybody who they didn't see as being on their side.
Exactly.
And we saw this with climate experts at the Interior Department, for example.
Oh yeah, they were removed.
Yeah.
Because their findings didn't fit with the administration's stance on climate change.
That's right. And then there was the infamous Schedule F executive order.
Oh yeah.
This one was a really big deal.
It was a huge deal.
Because it aimed to strip job protections from tons of civil servants.
Yes.
Which would have made it super easy to just replace them with loyalists.
With people who would toe the line.
Yeah. And the sources really paint this as part of a strategy to dismantle what they saw as the deep state.
Schedule F was a major red flag for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, if it had actually gone through, it would have completely changed how the civil service works.
Wow.
Tens of thousands of experienced government employees could have been fired just because they weren't seen as loyal enough.
So what was the immediate impact of all of this? Did it actually work? Did people start to censor themselves out of fear?
Absolutely. People became afraid to do their jobs properly.
Wow.
They worried about being targeted.
Yeah.
Imagine you've spent your career in public service and now you're suddenly scared to speak up or do your job because you might be labeled as disloyal.
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
What about the long-term consequences? What happens when you replace all that experience and expertise with loyalty?
Well, the sources suggest that it has really far-reaching implications.
Yeah.
When you lose institutional knowledge and nonpartisan expertise, it can be really damaging.
Right.
It can take years to rebuild that. And in the meantime, It can lead to less effective governance and even more corruption and mismanagement.
It's scary how quickly institutions can be eroded like that.
It is.
And it often happens without people even realizing it's happening. But as bad as all this is, it's important to look at it in a broader historical context.
I agree.
It's kind of spooky how history is just full of these stories about purges, and they don't usually end well.
Yeah, it's almost like a cautionary tale that keeps repeating itself.
Exactly. So, where do we even begin with all this?
I think Nazi Germany in 1933 is a perfect example.
Okay.
One of the first things they did was pass this law that basically allowed them to get rid of anyone who wasn't loyal to the Nazi party.
So like Jews and political opponents.
Exactly. It was called the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service.
Right.
Sounds all nice and bureaucratic.
Yeah.
But really, it was all about grabbing power.
So they basically just kicked out anyone who they thought was a threat.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it seemed to work for them at first.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they took control of everything really quickly. The courts, the education system, you name it. There was barely any resistance.
But what about the long-term consequences? Like, they had to have lost a lot of talented people.
Oh, they did.
Yeah.
Germany lost a ton of brilliant minds, scientists, academics, people who could have helped them.
Yeah.
But they ended up contributing to other countries instead.
It's almost like they sabotaged themselves by getting rid of all those people.
That's a good way to put it.
So it wasn't just about the loss of talent either, was it?
No, it wasn't. The bureaucracy itself became a tool for carrying out some of their worst policies.
Like the Holocaust.
Exactly. The effects were immediate and brutal.
Damn.
I mean, within a couple of years, they had complete control.
Wow.
And it was a key factor in their ability to carry out their agenda.
So they tried to consolidate power, and it ended up leading to one of the worst things in history.
That's a scary thought.
Are there any other examples of these purges backfiring?
Oh, yeah, plenty. Look at Stalin's Great Purge in the Soviet Union back in the late 1930s.
Okay.
Stalin was paranoid about everyone,
Uh-huh.
even his own military leaders.
So he went after them too.
He did.
Wow.
He had thousands of officers imprisoned or executed,
Wow.
even some of his best generals.
So he basically just got rid of his best people out of fear.
Yeah, basically. And at first, it looked like it worked.
Yeah.
Nobody dared to challenge him, but it completely backfired when it came to the military.
So did this weakness play a role in their struggles during World War II?
Oh, absolutely. The Red Army suffered massive losses in the early part of the war, partly because they just didn't have good leadership anymore.
So his paranoia ended up hurting him in the long run.
It did. And it's another example of how prioritizing loyalty over competence can be disastrous.
Wow. It seems like this happens over and over again. Are there any more recent examples?
Sure. Look at what happened in Hungary in the 2010s with Viktor Orbán. His government basically replaced a lot of experienced civil servants with people who were loyal to his party.
So did they get more control over the government?
Yeah, in the short term, but it led to a lot of problems down the road.
Like what?
Well, they lost a lot of expertise and there was a lot more corruption.
So they traded long-term stability for short-term gains.
It's a classic mistake. And it's not limited to authoritarian regimes either.
Really?
Yeah. Even in democracies, these purges can do a lot of damage. Take Turkey, for example.
Okay.
After the failed coup in 2016,
Right.
President Erdogan launched this massive purge.
Yeah.
Over 100,000 public sector workers were fired or suspended.
Wow, 100,000.
Teachers, judges, military officers, you name it.
So what was the reason for all this?
It was all about consolidating power and making sure there was no opposition.
Did it work?
Well, in the short term, yeah.
Yeah.
He got rid of his opponents and shifted more power to the presidency.
Right.
But again, there were these long-term consequences.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. What happened in Turkey?
Well, they lost a ton of experienced people.
Right.
And it really hurt their institutions. The judiciary became less independent. People were afraid to speak out. It was a mess.
So it sounds like these purges almost always backfire in the long run.
They do. They weaken institutions and they create this climate of fear.
Okay, so one more example. What about Venezuela?
Venezuela. Back in 2003, President Chavez purged the national oil company, PDVSA.
The oil company.
Yep. After a big strike, he fired something like 40% of the workforce.
40%? That's a lot.
It was anyone who he saw as disloyal.
So what happened?
It worked in the short term.
Yeah.
He broke the strike and got control of the oil industry.
But
But the long-term consequences were terrible.
I bet.
PDVSA used to be this really well-run company, but after the purge, it was a disaster. The new management didn't know what they were doing, And they were more interested in rewarding loyalists than in actually running the company.
So what happened to Venezuela's oil production?
It plummeted.
Wow.
Oil revenues went down, mismanagement and corruption went up.
It's like a textbook example of how not to run a company.
Pretty much. Chavez thought he was consolidating power, but he ended up hurting the entire country.
It's incredible how history just keeps repeating itself.
It does. And it shows how important it is to have safeguards in place to protect against these purges.
That's a great point. So let's shift gears now and talk about those safeguards.
Okay.
What can we actually do to stop this kind of thing from happening?
Okay, so we've seen just how bad these purges can be and the damage they can cause. But what can we actually do about it? Like, do democracies even have tools to fight back when a leader tries to just replace all the experts with loyalists? That's the big question, isn't it? The good news is that democracies do have ways to protect themselves, but they're often put to the test when you're dealing with these kinds of authoritarian tactics. It's almost like a race against time.
Okay, so let's talk about those ways to fight back. What can be done to protect against these purges?
Well, one of the first lines of defense is the civil service system itself. In the U.S., the basis for that is the Pendleton Act.
Okay.
It goes all the way back to 1883, and it was created specifically to stop presidents from just handing out government jobs to their friends and supporters.
So no more handing out favors for political support.
Exactly. The idea is that you can't just hire or fire career federal employees based on their politics.
Okay.
And that includes most government workers, except for those in very top positions.
I see.
They have these really strict rules about due process. So you can't just fire someone without a good reason. You have to give them notice and evidence.
Right.
And they even have the right to appeal.
So a president can't just come in and fire everyone who's not on his team.
Nope, not without breaking the law. And to make those protections even stronger, especially after that whole Schedule F thing we talked about, the Office of Personnel Management created a new rule in 2024 that's designed to prevent anyone from stripping away job protections just by reclassifying jobs.
So that was a direct response to what happened.
It definitely was. And we should also mention the role that unions play in all of this.
Right.
Federal employee unions can actually file grievances or even lawsuits to try to stop dismissals that they think are politically motivated.
So it's not just about individual rights, it's about collective action too.
Right. It's about protecting the whole system.
What about Congress? Can they do anything to push back against these purges?
Oh, yeah. Congress has a super important role to play. They have the power to investigate and expose these firings. They can hold hearings and issue subpoenas and really shine a light on what's going on.
Like they did during Watergate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remember Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre?
Yeah, when he tried to fire the special prosecutor.
Right, and that really backfired on him.
Yeah.
The public hearings they held put a ton of pressure on him. And it eventually led to some much-needed reforms. Congress can also pass laws to strengthen protections for civil servants.
So they could potentially pass a law that would prevent something like Schedule F from ever happening again.
They could. And let's not forget about the power of the purse.
Right. Congress controls the money.
Exactly. They could use that to pressure agencies.
Right.
They can withhold funds or even add things to spending bills that would stop agencies from using money for certain kinds of personnel actions.
So they have some real leverage there.
They do.
What about the courts? Can they step in and stop a purge?
Absolutely. Federal judges can issue injunctions to put a stop to firings or reassignments if they think they violate the law.
Right.
And employees or groups like unions can actually sue if they believe a purge is violating civil service laws or First Amendment rights.
So have we seen the courts actually step in like that?
We have. Even during the Trump administration, some of his attempts to weaken those protections were blocked by the courts.
So it's an important check on executive power.
It is.
So we've got laws, we've got Congress, we've got the courts. Are there any other safeguards?
Yeah, there are. For example, things like independent agencies, those are helpful. Like the Federal Reserve is supposed to be somewhat insulated from political pressure.
Right.
And some positions have fixed terms that are designed to span multiple administrations.
So like the FBI director.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
These things are supposed to make it harder for a president to just come in and get rid of people they don't like.
Okay, so those structures are meant to provide at least some pushback.
Exactly. And then there are also the inspectors general.
Oh, yeah. They're like the internal watchdogs.
Yep. They can investigate things like mismanagement or abuse and report directly to Congress.
But what if the inspector general gets purged too? I mean, that happened under Trump, didn't it?
You're right, it did happen.
Yeah.
And it caused a lot of problems. But it also led to some proposals to make it a lot harder to remove an inspector general in the future.
And maybe some good will come out of that.
Hopefully. And we also have to talk about whistleblowers and the press. They're both super important.
Right.
They play a huge role in exposing stuff that's going wrong.
It takes a lot of courage to speak out like that, though.
It does. But whistleblowers are often the first ones to see corruption happening. They can report it to Congress or the media.
And the press can investigate it and make it public.
Exactly. It's all about bringing those things out into the open.
It seems like shining a light on these things can be really powerful.
It can. Like, remember how the reporting on Schedule F helped to get it repealed?
Right.
That's a perfect example. And it shows how important public awareness is.
Yeah, the more people know about these issues, the better.
Right. The more likely they are to hold their leaders accountable.
So we've talked about laws, Congress, the courts, whistleblowers, the press. It seems like there are a lot of safeguards in place.
There are. But there's one more thing we can't forget. Internal resistance.
Okay.
I'm talking about people within the system having the courage to say no to orders that are unlawful or unethical. Career officials or even political appointees can push back, refuse to carry out those orders, or even threaten to resign.
Has that ever actually happened?
It has. When Trump tried to put in a loyalist as attorney general to try to overturn the election results, the entire EOJ leadership threatened to quit if he did it.
And that stopped him.
It did. And remember that Saturday night massacre we talked about?
Yeah.
The top two people at the DOJ resigned rather than fire the Watergate special prosecutor.
So sometimes people are willing to put their principles before their jobs.
They are. It shows how important it is to have people with integrity in those positions.
That's inspiring.
It is?
So it sounds like there are a lot of safeguards, but it also sounds like it all depends on people being brave enough to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. But we also have to be realistic.
Okay.
When someone is determined to grab power and purge institutions, they can move pretty fast.
Yeah.
They only have to win once. But the people fighting back have to win every single time.
That's a sobering thought. It sounds like a never-ending battle.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
But it's a battle worth fighting. Our democracy depends on it.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into political purges, I want to leave you with this. We've talked about all these safeguards, laws, courts, watchdogs, but in the end, it comes down to individual choices. What would it take for you to become a whistleblower or stand up to an unlawful order? What sacrifices would you be willing to make to protect our democracy? These are tough questions, but they're important ones. We all have a role to play in safeguarding our democracy. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to learn more about the organizations working to protect against authoritarianism like the ACLU or Protect Democracy. Think about how you can get involved and support their efforts. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.